Hello and welcome to the A300/A310 ground school. I know it's been a very long time coming since we continued this series, but been extremely busy with the A310 release and all the other variants around that and the Beluga and everything, so we've had to focus on that, but now I'm back with this tutorial series. We're going to continue it in the A310 freighter, not the A300. Reason for that is it's going to be the best representation of the A300 version 2, which is obviously the one that most people are going to use moving forward, and it's going to be the best representation for the A310 customers because it is literally the A310. But from an operational standpoint, they're the same, so nothing for you to worry about. And if you don't have the A300 version 2, which obviously is not out yet, but maybe you are when you watch this video, the operationally, for normal operations as we're doing now, it'll work the same way. So where are we and where are we going? We're still going from East Midlands Airport to London Luton Airport. I've rewound the video because I know in the last flight we were in the air, but I want to take a fresh start and talk about the takeoff again. And we're going to depart now, so you can follow along on the routing. Let me pop out the FMS. We are going off the runway 27 on the Daventry 3 Yankee departure, and arrival wise into London Luton Airport, we're on runway 25, and it's via the ILS 25, and it's the female 1 Lima arrival. These aren't selected just because I've loaded an autosave, that's one of the reasons for that, but the routing is fully in there. So if you want to follow along, that's the routing that I put in, and we will take a look at the actual stuff in flight because it's only Daventry female and then the female arrival. Call sign wise, we are INI 001 Tango because we're training. We're going up to flight level 200. Profiles armed, nav armed, as we talked about before. Only thing I need to put in is our alternate is Echo Golf Lima Lima, so Heathrow Airport. And fuel wise, we're all looking good. Flaps, it's going to be a 15-15 departure, so not just the slats, the first setting of the slat. We've got max auto brake, and these are our figures for takeoff. I've clicked the send button, which has sent these over, and we have a flex of 59 and a trim of 1.7 down set, and we're 117 tons, so we're quite heavy in terms of our zero fuel weight, but we haven't got that much fuel on board. So one thing I need to clarify and go over now, because we have failures, we need to make sure that we set this V2 up correctly in the FCU. So can you see we have the speed here, 161, 161. You must press preset, and we must set our 250 knots here. Now, if your green dot speed, which is shown here as the VFTO, is above 250, then you would set that here. So let's say this number was 258, you'd set 258 in this window. Now, this is all done in case we have an engine failure. If you've not added an engine failure, then you're not going to get an engine failure, but it's good to set it up the correct way. So this is the way that we want to set it up. We have the flex set, so automatically at the thrust reduction altitude, which is 1,305 feet. For both of these, we're expecting the thrust to swap from flex to climb, which is this much N1, and we'll go back to flex. So if we use a flex takeoff, or we use any of the other settings, then it's automatically going to swap over because we're using profile. Nav will engage automatically at 30 feet, which is the equivalent of LNAV, and profile is the equivalent of VNAV. Will automatically engage at, effectively on takeoff. We don't have to bother with it, it does it itself, which is great. Lights, we've got all these lights on, we've got the wing light off because it's not needed. So I think we're ready to go. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the SOPs for a departure. So I'm going to set 50% N1, wait for it to stabilize. Not all operators did this, but I'm going to do it just because it's good practice. Then I will, just to make myself convenient, release the parking brake. You'd have released it before. And we will set the go levers. Now you can activate the go levers via this hidden little click spot here, which isn't a real one, but obviously it's very easy to reach. Or there's one on the inside here that's, you can see it's awkward to get to because in real life it's inside, so it's very easy to click with your thumb and your finger when you're actually holding a thrust lever, but we're in the sim, so it's quite difficult to do, and you can assign that to a switch as well if you so wish. Then once the engines are spooled up, I will be holding the control wheel half forward the whole time until 80 knots, then I will slowly release it by 100 knots, and I will call 100 knots. V1, rotate, slow rotation up, to the flight directors, or initially 15 degrees roughly, and then following the flight directors. After that, positive climb, gear up, and the autopilot can come in. The autopilot can come in, I think, 100 feet or 200 feet after takeoff. You use the minimum you can engage it, so pretty much straight away, to be perfectly honest, if you so wish. It's quite a sophisticated autopilot on the A310. So why don't we go? So I'm going to release the parking brake early. Actually, I'll do it the proper way. Set 50% N1 roughly. This is just to let the engine stabilise. That looks good to me. Now I'm going to press this, because I've got one hand, and I'm going to hold the stick half forward. We're doing this in case we have a low-speed engine failure. We have more controllability on the nose wheel because there's more sort of weight transferred to it. That's effectively the reason why you do this. And also in case you've got an FCG, it might tip the plane, but should be fine. Okay, the thrust is set. So we're 80 knots. We start to slowly release by 100 knots, and we call 100 knots. We're now in the high-speed regime, and takeoff inhibit is shown. V1, rotate. Positive climb, gear up. Now one thing to note is don't mess with the trim too much. So my hand is off, I'm not touching it, and you can see it's actually set quite a nice spot. You heard me blip the trim. I didn't really need to do that. So P thrust, P climb. So now what's happened is we've hit that 1305 feet, so it's asked us to accelerate. So we can see the thrust has come back to climb thrust, which you can see here, and I'm going to engage autopilot 1. We're above F speed, so we can go flaps 15-0. Engaging the turn to the left already, and we're above S speed, so we can go flaps 0, so flaps fit 0, 0, so flaps up. We can still accelerating, which is great. We can see the speed is moving just as the slats are moving. There we go. So 250 knots is obviously what it's accelerated to. If you had a speed constraint on this departure, then it would automatically go to that speed constraint of say 220, 210, whatever knots. It is very conventional, like a normal Airbus would. So what do we do after takeoff? We put the gear to neutral. We disarm the ground spoilers, and we turn off the nose light, and we turn off the turn-off lights. Now we do these because think about it, the gear, all these lights are associated with the landing gear. Well, they're stuck up in the bay, so there's no point in them being on anymore. I'm going to use the pause function on this flight a bit because I don't want to get too far ahead because it's a very, very short flight. So what are we expecting next? So we're expecting this turn. You can see it's cutting the corner. This is all the brand new nav code that comes from the A310, and there's also the Beluga. Will be on the A300 version too. Yeah, we're looking good, right? Gear is up, everything's up. Let's do the after takeoff checklist, and this is located in the checklist section. I don't know why I can't find that. Let's zoom in. So, slats and flaps retracted, the gear is up at neutral, which it is, packs are on, and the altimeters, it's a good reminder, we can set standard now as we are above the transition level. So, there we go, after takeoff checklist is completed. Now I want to take a moment to talk about some of these modes. So at the moment you can see we're in profile. I'm going to pause for a split second. As I said, I'm going to use some pausing. We're in profile, and we're at 250 knots, and that makes sense. So shortly we're going to be passing flight level 100, and it's going to automatically accelerate to 250 knots. Now let's imagine ATC said, I want you to expedite your climb. Not that you'd ever need that in an A300 or an A310, but never mind. I want to expedite your climb, but please maintain 250 knots. So there's a few ways we can do this. So I'm going to pause and unpause just so I can change the FMS page. Now we're on what is called the TACT mode page. Now it's commonly referred to as a tactical intervention, which sounds like something you need to sit around and, we're having an intervention, you need help. No, it's it's not that. It's basically where you can take control of the speed that the aircraft is flying in profile. I know this is getting a bit complicated, so let's do a bit of a review. Profile is the equivalent of VNAV. Profile gets its speeds from the FMS. So, 250 knots below flight level 100, it will accelerate to the speed that's shown on the FMS after that, and it will keep accelerating. Right? It will decelerate and all this sort of stuff. But, unlike a 320, we can't just go, oh, I want you to stay in VNAV and fly a certain speed. Because let's try that now. So if I say, oh, I want to go 250, well, look what just happened. It's changed to level change, and our FMA has changed, and it's not accelerated automatically at flight level 100. So remember we were saying about how to expedite one of those things. This is a way to do it. You can just select the speed, bang, and it will revert straight to level change. But we no longer have any of the stuff from VNAV. It's completely disengaged. There is no VNAV in the climb in the A300 or 310 anyway, but that's besides the point. You can imagine that in the descent that would be a bit of an issue if we were doing a complicated arrival. So that's one way. So we're now going to stay at 250 knots. We're going to climb a bit quicker because we're not accelerating, and we would expedite. We could also do this. We'll also come across to the TRP and click MCT. So you can see the thrust is going to increase all the way up, and our climb rate will increase even more. But it's a bit too much. I'm not a big fan of it, so I'm going to go back to auto, which will bring us back to the climb thrust. So what's the third way we can do this? Well, we're going to put it back into profile. See how it wants to go to 314 knots? But I'm going to type in 250 into this box here, and then I'm going to select it again. Boom. So now, see, it's flying 250 knots. That makes sense? So I want to do 260 knots. Click. I want to do 240 knots, click, 255 knots. I think you get the idea, right? So effectively you can adjust the speed that the aircraft flies at in profile mode, so we keep the VNAV element, but we could adjust the speed by typing it in here. We can't just select it on there. Now if we go back to Econ, it's going to go back to the speed it gets from the FMS. And if we select maximum climb, this is the green dot speed. So it's going to now really expedite. So if they really wanted us to expedite, we could have just pressed that. Okay, so now we're back in Econ. You can see it's starting to pitch over to accelerate up to 314 knots. Now the one danger that you have with this is if you leave it on the selected speed, so 255 like this, I know I keep doing it just to show you, it's not going to return back to Econ itself automatically. This is kind of an older system. What it's going to do is it's going to basically just sit there at 255, and let's say you had a speed constraint of 220 knots. It's going to go, I don't care, you told me to be at 255, and it's just going to ignore you. So you need to make sure that once you're finished with whatever you're doing, speed-wise, that you set it back to Econ so that the FMS can take over with it at some point. So here's another example. So if I go into vertical speed, you can see that the speed window is opened on the current speed of 314 that it had, and profile's disengaged because we can't have, remember, profile mode with anything else. So we've kind of gone, I want you to disengage, so then speed is disconnected and it's gone, hey, you have control of the speed, and vertical speed wise now I'm in control of the aircraft, so it basically disengages profile, which makes sense, right? If we put it back in, you can see it's going to increase the thrust up again, but I don't want it to. I actually want it to be in vertical speed, because that should work out nicely. So we're approaching Delta Tango Yankee, so we're approaching Daventry. So we're going to need a little bit more time to explain and set up for our arrival, so let's hold Daventry. So how do we do that? So we click on Daventry, we click on hold, and we can adjust the figures here so we can change the inbound course, a left turn or whatever turn we want to do, and I can click insert. So now we can see if I open the flight plan up, we have the little arrow, so we have the hold in there at Daventry, and we can even see it in the flight plan, hold, blah 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 blah. So that's looking good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take control of the speed actually, because you can see if we're not in profile, it's not going to slow down for the hold, right? Remember? Because now we're in control of the speed entirely. So let's go to the TACT page. Let's click let's say something, let's let it level off first. So see how we have alt star and then alt? That's what happens when you're in sort of a normal mode, right? So if I click profile now, just before I stop yabbering on, I'll explain what I just did in a moment. So when you're in profile mode and you level off, it doesn't say alt star or whatever. It just says P climb, and then it levels off and it swaps to P alt. It's a quirk of the A310, basically. It doesn't let you know it's leveling off. It just starts to level off, and then it levels itself off and says, "Oh, I'm level." And you're like, "Okay, good to know," sort of thing. So it's just a bit of a strange one. So can you see I've gone to the maximum endurance speed on the cruise TACT page, which is basically a green dot speed. So that's what we want to hold at. So I'm going to set that now. So it started to decelerate, getting ready for when it goes into the hold. Now, what do we have to do to set up for our arrival? Well, we need to get the weather, we need to insert the minima, and we need to talk about the approach, and set up the ILS. So let's do that now. So it's going to go into the hold. I trust it. I trust it enough anyway. We've got the approach checks to do at some point as well. So we can get the weather from here, and we can see we have 270 at 12. QNH is 1017, so that's fine. We can set that afterwards. And we have a temperature of 16 degrees Celsius. That looks good. So we're going to enter the hold shortly. I'm a bit fast because I was messing around with the speed, so the hold's going to be a bit strange when it comes in. So where do we have to put this? So let's look at this page here. So we have all the selections. So landing weight, our landing flap, we're going to be landing with full flap, so 30-40 or 20-20. So we need to select this here. And so let's say we were going to do a 20-20, okay? You'd select this and flick that. Have to do both. If you don't do both, you're going to get a too low flap warning, and if you don't select it here, you're going to get the wrong speed. So I'm going to go back to 30-40, and can you see how my approach speed changes here? It's not always 10 knots, by the way, it's just roughly around 10 knots. Here, this is our green dot speed, this is our S speed, this is our F speed, and this is our wind correction, and this is our MDA, which is our minimum. I believe it's 440 for this approach. So I'm going to set that in now. Let's take a moment to talk about wind correction. So, it's not really like a Boeing. It's more like an Airbus in the way that it does this. So VAPP, so velocity of the approach, so the velocity of approach speed. This is, let's zoom in. Remember we talked about this in the original lesson. This is VLS, so the velocity lowest selectable. So the lowest airspeed that we can select, the lowest airspeed that we really should ever be flying at all. Normally it's way slower than we should be going, but anyway. On the approach, its standard is VLS, so this speed, plus 5 knots. And that's what this is. So this is VLS with a 5 knot margin in already. So if we look at our wind today, it's 270 at 12 knots. Okay, so it's a 12 knot headwind. Is 1/3 of 12 more than 5? No, my maths gives me correctly there, but no, it is not. So we've already got a 5 knot correction built into the approach speed, so we don't need any wind correction. We only start to need use this wind correction if it's more than 5 knots, if that makes sense. So it's not you always need to put a wind correction. It defaults to 0, and often you will land with 0. So if you have like I say, a wind where, let's say, 20 knots, so obviously 1/3 of 20 is more than 5 knots, you can put a correction in to bring that up to the correct amount, because there's already 5 knots of correction built into this speed, right? I think it makes sense, but effectively you don't always need to put 5 or 10, because then you're going to be very, very fast on the approach. It's not as it's not like a Boeing where you need that 1/3 regardless. There's already that 5 knots built in. Bit of a ramble, but I think it makes sense. What does this final app mean? Please don't press this inadvertently. I've done it before. It's not good. So this tells the aircraft, oh, we're on the approach, and it will just slow down in profile mode to green dot speed and try and decelerate. Very much like a 320, but not quite as sophisticated. So don't press that inadvertently. Only press it when you need to, and often it will automatically activate itself anyway. So we've set up the FMS. Let's take a look at our flight plan, because I don't really want to go around the hole more than once, so I want to try and get this done quickly. So we are going to show constraints on here, remember? So we've got 250 knots, then we've got Bravo Kilo Yankee, Buster, Laurel, and then from there we continue down with a constraint of 3,000 feet or above onto the ILS for runway 25, and it's a 3-degree approach with all the different speeds in there. We can see that makes sense with the missed approach going up to 3,000 feet and then coming back on ourselves, and then we have E-throw. So that makes sense, right? Obviously you check this thoroughly against the charts when you normally do it to see if it all matches up. So that looks good to me. So we need to now put the ILS frequency in. Now, one way we can do this, which is a bit of a cheat, but normally always works, is you can go on the map, press M, select this to IFR low en route, and can you see the frequency? 109er, 15, and make sure we put the course in of 255. It doesn't matter what your chart says. I know this sounds really bad. It doesn't matter at all what your chart says. This is the frequency that the X-plane is expected to see. So if you ever want to know what the frequency is definitely going to work, this is the one that's going to work, because that's the one that's on the scenery, the one that it's expecting. So we have got the frequency set in here, and we are good to go, really, so I think we're happy to continue. So how do we exit a hold? Well, there's a few ways we can do this, so let's go back up to the top. So we could just click clear on the hold if we wanted to, but actually the autopilot would disconnect because it wouldn't know where to go. It would be in a discontinuity, and it would disconnect the autopilot, which wouldn't be ideal. We could go direct to FINMA, which is actually one of the easiest ways to do it, to be honest, because then you're effectively just bypassing the hold. Or you can click immediate exit, and we're going to do that. So what this means is next time over the point, so next time over Delta Tango Yankee, which will be in a minute, it's going to exit the hold, which is actually exactly what we want. We want it to go and not do another lap, we want it to just exit. Now if you want to go, oh actually no, I want to keep going in the hold, you would click resume hold. So I clicked immediate exit, resume hold showing that the option for that is to keep in the hold, but we have said no, we want to exit. So now it's going to automatically exit that hold, which is good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back onto the TACT page, and I'm going to click on Econ. It's going to accelerate now, remember, because we're not in the hold, which is correct because it's going to exit, and we have our top of descent coming up here. And we're going to talk about what altitude we want to set in here and what we want to descend to, etc, etc. So we're going to try and let the VNAV do a lot of it. The VNAV in the real A300 and 310 is pretty atrocious, to be perfectly honest. It's not very useful at all. It's very much inaccurate in its calculation of its descent path. Some A300 pilots have told us that they were in descent, and then sometimes you saw it cycle up and go, oh, 6,000 feet high, even though it showed you a profile. Very nice. And it also oscillates quite a lot, but up and down when it goes in descent. So actually, the representation in the A300 and 310, the INI, it's a little bit too good, to be perfectly honest. But it's still by no means a press and forget. We made it like that on purpose because that's not true and faithful to the actual aircraft. So let's talk about how we can start a descent. We're going to talk about the most complicated way now. So we're going to do arm immediate descent. So I'm going to click this in, which remember makes it scroll in thousands. I'm going to set down the platform altitude, which was, remember we saw it before, 3,000 feet. And I'm now going to pull the knob. When I mean pull the knob, do you see this little arrow? So this is when I get this little down arrow, do you see it there? That's a pull, right? Okay, that's the pull. So why is this important? So can you see how we have PDES in blue and 3,000s in the window, and we've not started to descend? So what this means is it means that it's actually going to automatically descend when it reaches top of descent. And that's the only way that you can make the aircraft go down without you being there. Because obviously what we could do now is if we just click level change, it's going to just go down in level change. So idle thrust. If we just toggle profile now, it's just going to start an early descent, like it would in a 320. If we use vertical speed, it's just going to start a descent. But with this way, it's actually going to start its descent without us doing anything. So we can set the altitude in, pull the knob, immediate descent is armed, and then it will go down itself. See? Bingo. Retard, PDES, and it's going down in idle now. It's going to get a little bit above profile because it's skipping this corner slightly, but let's see how it gets on. So you can see the VDEV scale shows up now, and we can see our vertical deviation on here. Now here's the thing that's really annoying. If you have ILS selected and you're within a certain amount of miles, it actually removes the VDEV. So I see people saying, oh, I lost my VDEV, my VNAV dropped out. No, you probably just had ILS selected. So make sure you set this later in the approach, not early on. Otherwise, at some point, you'll not see it. So here we go. See how it's already got a little bit above profile. So now it's above profile. The system is quite sophisticated still. What it's going to do is it's going to go, right, so I'm above profile. I'm going to come to idle. Now this is idle at this altitude. And it's going to increase its airspeed to try and get back on profile. And can you see how it's not saying more drag yet? Because it's still pretty happy that we're getting back on profile. There's no big drama here. I think I'm going to be able to recover it. So that's why it's not bothering you yet. So here it is increasing its airspeed slowly but surely to try and get back on profile. Now where things are not going to work out is this speed constraint, because it's going to need to get down to 250 knots. So it's using the airspeed to increase, and then it's going to be told, oh, you need to go back to 250 knots, and then it's going to struggle. But here we go. We're coming back on profile now. So you can see it's not, I wouldn't say it's a useless system. It works really quite well for a lot of approaches, especially complicated step-down approaches, because you can set the altitude in and it will automatically level off. So if we had a constraint ahead of us, let's say Bombo was 11,000 or above, with 3,000 in our FCU window here, it would not go below it. It will automatically level itself off, and then it will start to descend again. So on a lot of these complicated arrivals into the US, you can simply set the last altitude, pull the knob, and it will step itself down, altitude by altitude by altitude, all on its own. Which is, for 1982, pretty good, if I'm honest. It's pretty good. So remember we were saying about this TACT page. Now, again, same thing, right? We can go max des, so it's going to go the fastest speed possible, but we don't want to do that. We want to leave it in econ, or we can type a speed in. You know, it's up to us. Obviously we can take control of the speed if we went into level change, and that all makes sense. So let's look at what's going to happen. We've got Bombo coming up where we need to decelerate, and then we're going to come around the corner, and then we'll come onto the approach here. So the landing lights are still extended. Obviously probably should have retracted those a bit earlier, but that's okay. It was a bit of a short flight. Let's talk about the auto brake. So I'm going to use auto brake medium. Now how have I worked out which ones I'm going to use? So I've got a new feature on here, landing performance. So I can click FMC data, so that makes sense, and I can do an ATIS request for runway 25. So can you see now 250 knots has come automatically because of this speed constraint? I'm going to preemptively just give it some speed brake because I know it's going to struggle. This is what I mean about the VNAV. It's sophisticated, but it ain't that sophisticated. I know from experience that you can see, look, it's getting slightly high on profile. It's coming back on the speed, so it needs a bit of speed brake to help it out now. Even though it would have said it eventually when it works it out, but sometimes it's better to just think ahead and help it. So we can go compute. And here we go. So we could use low auto brake if we wanted to, because we have a stop margin of 195 meters. But if we use medium auto brake, which is what I prefer to use, so there we go, 250 knots at Bombay, we made it. And you can see profile-wise, now it's saying less drag, because it is a bit sophisticated, right? So it's gone, hey, I'm getting back on profile. I don't need your drag anymore because I've made the speed constraint. So it's saying knock it off. So that's why we got the less drag message, which is not actually in the more modern Airbus family aircraft. So now what's going to happen shortly is, can you see we've got retard shown, so we're idle. It's probably going to get back on profile in a second, and it may go to P speed. Yeah, we'll see. It's possible. Anyway, back to this. So if we use medium auto brake, we almost have a kilometre stopping distance, so that's really nice. So what can we change on this? We can change the landing configuration, we can change the brake, and we can change the reverse setting. So we can use no reverse, idle reverse, full reverse, so it's up to us, and we can change the weather here. The landing distance, this is how long the physical aircraft will take to stop. In Europe, and I know it's starting to happen around the rest of the world, they add a 15% margin on top of this to give you your actual, like, sort of factored landing distance. So this is kind of like with a bit of a margin built in, and this is what's left from the distance of the runway. So we're more than fine with medium order rigs. So what the aircraft's doing now is, see, it's below profile, but it's desperately trying to keep it idle. So the system is designed to try and stay idle as long as possible to save fuel, effectively. So eventually it will drop out of this speed bracket, it will get low enough, and then it will go speed, up here, P-speed, and it will accelerate back up to 250 knots. But it's just trying to keep it idle as long as it can. Because actually, that's something that you'll see a lot of VNAVs don't do. The idea behind a VNAV is to stay at idle for as long as possible to save as much fuel as possible. And that's why they're in aircraft, that's why airlines want them. Because they're better than a pilot often at sort of calculating that from very, very far distances. When you get a bit closer in, they're definitely not. And I'm not sure I would describe the A300 and 310's VNAV as better than a pilot could do manually, but it was the beginning of that. It's very good. I'm going to leave it now. I just want to see it drop out of that speed bracket. See, P-speed, and now the thrust will kick back in, and it's going to accelerate back up to that 250 knots. It seems weird, so this is why I see people flying the A300 and they go, well, what's it doing? What's it doing? It's doing exactly what it should do. It stayed at idle for as long as possible, it got outside the speed range, it increased the thrust to get back up, and now can you see, back to idle again. Now why it went to idle again, we have the 220 knots constraint ahead. So it does know what it's doing, but you can see it's it's an older system. It's just a bit slow, and it will work it out. But it's doing a good job, really. You know, let's say I had to use the speed brakes for the 250 knots, and that's it. And now we're turning early, so it's going to make this is going to be you can imagine, pretty difficult for the LNAV to do. Let's have a look at the flight plan. So Buster is going to look weird. Now, why is Buster going to look weird? So see how it has this triangle like this. Now what that means is it's an overfly point. So you can see this didn't have a triangle. So what the aircraft did is it cut the corner to come back onto the track here to then come around the corner. Now Buster has this built into the database, so it's going to go over the top, it's going to come back, and then it's going to re-intercept this, because it means you must fly over the top of me. You cannot cut the corner. And this is just coded into different procedures. In the modern Airbus family aircraft, you can use a button on the FMS to define waypoints as overfly. Not possible in the A300 and 310. It's either in the FMS or it's not in the FMS, and that's it. So there's no way to change it. But this is a really good example, and let's have a look. If I click M on the map mode, can you see how it's actually done a really nice job with the LNAV? It doesn't look like it's doing a good job because of the fact that you can't see any curves, but look at what a nice job it just did on there. And we'll see the same thing here, where it's going to do this kind of goofy looking thing in a second. So we're below profile now, so it's going to get even lower below profile when we do the overfly. But this is what it's done now, is you can see it's in P speed. So it's added thrust in to maintain 1,000 feet per minute, which is just like the other modern Airbus family aircraft when it's below profile. So this is why people say, like, well, what's it doing? What's it doing? It's doing pretty sensible stuff, to be honest. It's doing what it should do. So we have got P out, and then it's leveling off. So let me set the QNH 1017. Let me set this over here as well. There we go. And remember, at Laurel, so let's go into here, zoom in. See how it has a flight level 70 or above, yeah? So we've got that in there, and I've just seen it's put Laurel in twice, probably because I loaded that autosave on the ground, so I'm going to clear that out and do that like that. So this is the correct one. So it's got that constraint, I need you to be above flight level 70 at Laurel, and we can actually see what it's doing. It's coming back around, and it automatically leveled off at flight level 70. See how it's just bringing the altitude down now. P alt, P des. So let's take a moment to process what I just said there. So we got to Buster. We'd already got to flight level 70, and the VNAV went, no lower than this. There's a constraint ahead that says I need to be above flight level 70. So it went, okay. So it went into P out, and then PDES, so the descent mode, arms, saying, okay, I'm going to level off, but I know I need to go down to 3,000 feet. So after I get to Laurel, I'm going to go down to 3,000 feet. It makes sense to me. It's fairly similar, to be honest, to the 320, whereas you get that alt constraint star and alt constraint, and they're all different colors, so it makes a lot more sense. This is basically saying, hey, I've leveled off at P alt. My profile has taken control of my altitude control, but I want to keep descending in PDES, which I will do automatically after Laurel, which is what it's going to do. But here's the thing. Are we high on profile? We are actually high on profile. I've done this approach in real life, and if you're at flight level 70 at Laurel, you are actually a little bit high, just the way that the approach is designed. So I'm going to actually wait to see the profile update itself. So what it should do is when it gets past Laurel, I'll imagine it will rerun the calculation and go, oh, hang on a minute, maybe I'm a little bit high. So here we go, we're going to pass Laurel. Maybe we're on profile, actually. We're okay actually. So again, retard, let's come back to idle because it's following the descent path. Now I'm going to click on the ILS, see how the VDEV has disappeared, which is kind of annoying because you can see it is now getting a bit high on the profile. So now I'm going to put out one setting of flap. And to be honest, in the real world now, and for me, I'm going to now take control of the aircraft because we're pretty close in, and I don't think it's fair to leave the VNAV now taking control of it, because I would most definitely be in control of this if I was flying it. So let's look at our speed. So see here, so 245 knots, I put out the first setting, and the next one we need to be below 210, so let's slow down to 205. Okay, so let's get the settings set. Second setting of flap out. There we go. And let's use a bit of speed brake as well. We're actually quite significantly above the profile now, just because I kind of didn't pay too much attention to it. But as I said, when you're at Laurel at that altitude, you are actually quite above profile. So let's go with the gear down early. It's going to create some extra drag, and it's going to be a glide sub intercept from above, which is good to show. So let's go lock star. We're going to wind the altitude way above. We're going to keep the vertical speed of 2,000 feet per minute. We're going to bring the speed back to 1,600 feet per minute, and I'm going to get the next set of flap out as well, and we'll leave it like this. And now I'm going to press land. I'll put the other autopilot in. So I press land. This gives us GS armed Cat 3. We can see we've already got the localizer established. Maybe a little bit steeper. Here comes the glide. Stow those and arm them. GS star, final set of flap, and now we're going to set the landing speed 138. There we go. So a little bit quick happened there. So we have got speed, GS, lock, Cat 3 dual. I've set my landing speed here. You have to set it manually, right? So it's not going to do it itself, even if we left it in profile. As glide slope engages, this speed window opens, so you need to control it. So I've taken the speed from here, which is 138 knots, and I've set it in the window. We've got our medium auto brakes set, and we are good to go. So let's make sure we have these lights on, these on with the gear down, and let's do the approach and landing checklist, because we've been talking a little bit too much. Approach signs are set, briefing is confirmed, the ECAM status was checked, the altimeters are on there, minimums are 420, ignition we don't need it on, and landing elevation is set at 400. Landing gear is down, auto brakes are medium, Anti-skid is checked on at normal, slats 30-40, and spoilers are armed. So we are good to go. Remember we were saying about that VLS? See how we're VLS +5? That looks good to me. And the wind is as expected, so 270 and 16. And our pitch, angle of attack all makes sense. So with the glide slope intercept from above, what I did was I pressed the localizer button. I then set the altitude above our current altitude, pulled the vertical speed, and then I pressed the land button to make sure that we intercepted the localizer and pulled the speed back. But anyway, let's focus on the landing, and we're going to pause for a second because I want to talk about the landing technique a little bit. So I see a lot of people landing the A300 and the 310 and saying it's really difficult to land. It is slightly difficult, mainly in windy conditions because of the limited roll control input. But it's once you get a technique down, it's not that difficult. What you need to do, and this is my big pro tip, stop messing with the trim. You can see I did this on purpose, right? I disconnected the autopilot, and I'm going to unpause it. Look, it's flying perfectly fine. I haven't touched the controls yet, so there's no real need to keep messing with the trim. It's in trim right now, and the trim speed in the A300 and 310 is extremely fast. And when I mean extremely fast, I mean in the magnitude of 2 to 3 times quicker than, say, a 737. And if you watch a real pilot flying the A310, you'll hear the trim click like this. It's like click, click, click. It's very, very small blips. If you do end up holding it down, that's why after, I think it's 2 seconds, you get the wooler. The wooler is a warning. If you ever hear the wooler when you're manual flight, that's effectively a warning for runaway trim. So you never should hear it. If you do, you're really, really trimming the aircraft quite a lot. And if you end up trimming it too much nose up and then too much nose down, you end up in this oscillation where you think the aircraft is unstable, but you are making it unstable. So my biggest tip is disconnect the autopilot. You trim if you need to, but just for the first little bit, see if you can fly the aircraft without needing to trim, because often it's already in trim, and actually you can kind of fly through it, and use pitch to get it there, and you go, yep, okay, it's nice and stable, and then just a tiny little blip either way if you need it, and that will make your landings a lot more controlled as you come down. As we said before, my other tip is leave the auto thrust in. You can take it out by all means, and you can leave it in. They're both valid techniques. The auto thrust will automatically come to idle at 30 feet, so you don't have to worry about any of that. It's going to do it all itself. But obviously if you do manual thrust, just like a normal aircraft, you're going to have to just close it yourself as you initiate the flare. That's the point that you should close the thrust levers when you're landing any Airbus, in fact. Well, any Airbus that I'm aware of, even the modern stuff. But leaving the auto thrust in gives you your mind, it's not something else to sort of focus on. It's one less thing to worry about. The only issue is if it's a windy day and you get lots of thrust changes, then it can end up meaning that you're having to sort of, pitch the aircraft to try and compensate. Because remember, this aircraft does not have fly-by-wire. So if the engines spool up, so you get more power, then the nose is going to come up. If they get less thrust and they come down, the nose is going to come down. So you'll need to compensate for that. And obviously, you're not in control of that if the auto thrust is on. So it's kind of doing its own thing and you're kind of fighting it. But, it's up to you. It's personal preference, but I recommend leaving it on once you get used to landing the aircraft. The next bit we're going to talk about is general techniques for landing an airliner. Not specific to the A300 or A310 at all, but I found this helps me a lot when I'm in the sim. So we have a lot of instrumentations inside the aircraft, right? We have the glide slope, the localizer, all these different really nice instruments giving us good information. The biggest instrument in the entire aircraft is the windshield. It's 10 times bigger than anything else and will give you every single piece of information that you need to land the plane. And I really mean that. I can, and I know others can. I'm not saying that I'm a Superman or anything when it comes to landing. I can quite easily land an airliner without looking inside, if so required. Just like you land a light aircraft. Because, airspeed is the one that's a bit tricky with that one. You have to kind of put your finger in the air and go, I think I'm doing about this. So it's not ideal, but obviously that's an extreme case. So what do I mean? Well, when you're looking at the windscreen of an aircraft, It's telling you exactly how high you are, how low you are, if you're left, if you're right, if you're descending too much, whatever. It's giving you all this information. So what I highly recommend is keeping the distance from the top of the glare shield, so roughly where that sort of middle screw is, towards where the threshold is, so where you want to touch down, at a fixed distance in the window. This is the key to landing an airliner, or any aircraft in fact. Keeping this distance fixed on the correct path. So as you come down the approach, you're scanning outside and inside. And I'm going to verbally say it now about how much I look. It sounds a bit stupid, but at 1,000 feet, you're looking about like this. Outside, inside, outside, inside, outside, inside. That's how fast your scan needs to be. And you need to gather a lot of information when you look inside. You're looking at your airspeed, your glide, your localizer, your thrust. And you're looking at all these different places and then scanning in and out. As you get nearer to the runway, so closer to landing, your scan ends up going more like this. It's more outside, 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 inside, outside, outside, outside. And that's something that often you really have to force yourself to do, because remember I told you that these instrumentations in here are giving you good information. They're not invalid, but you can end up chasing them, and that is the issue. And that is exacerbated by the fact that if you're then trimming the A300, you end up just wallowing down the approach. So really focus on the outside, really focus on all that great information that you're seeing visually. And you can say to yourself, well, what happens if it's foggy? Well, then you should be doing an autoland. So, you know, you can gather this information from even marginal VFR conditions, which obviously is what you would need to land anyway. So, the scan rate, you need to have a high scan rate. It needs to become more and more visual. And by 50 feet over the threshold, you must be looking at the end of the runway. You must to initiate the flare. Okay? So they're my tips, really. Let's see how it goes. I know it's one of those things that it's much easier said than done, but keep practicing it. I also, this is post-commentary me, the footage here, it's a little bit choppy. Now, unfortunately, when I recorded it was perfectly smooth, but I've tried to render this video 5, 6, maybe more times, and because it's such a long project, it just seems to be causing a bit of stutter. Do apologise for that, but I think you still gather all the information that you would need for this section. And also the replays that show you the approach, they seem to be fine. So without further ado, let's get on with the approach. I won't edit it out. If I do a bad landing, it's going to stay in because these happen, okay? So here we go. So remember, inside, outside. So I'm looking outside. I mean, it's looking good to me. Inside, yeah, the glide is indicating I'm a little bit low. So I'm going to just bring it back a little bit. Inside, outside, outside. Still looking outside. Still making sure that aiming point is in the fixed place in the window. Looking inside. Yep, that looks good. Speed is good. Outside, outside. And we're aiming to be 50 foot. So when we hit a 50 call, and we're over the threshold. Outside. Still looking outside. You can see we're getting a bit low. Yeah, glide is indicating the same thing. Outside, inside. Looking a little bit, yeah, a little bit high. Ignoring the VAPPs, they're always wrong in the sim. Inside, outside. I would say we are a smidgen high though. Outside, I'm going to actually correct up a little bit. Inside, and then we're looking outside all the way now. Focusing completely outside now, not even bothering looking inside. Lovely. Okay. Spoilers. Reverse green. Decel. We see the decel with a little green bar there, or if we feel it. Okay, so reverse is coming off, and I'm going to disconnect the auto brakes. You can tap the brakes or whatever. I have a little clicky joystick thing, so it's going to be a bit like a bit firm on the braking, as you can see there. So, but I hope that made sense, right? So I'm going to taxi off the runway now. We're going to talk about that and watch it in a replay a few times. But it was actually a pretty good landing, to be perfectly honest. And you can see we easily made the turn off. Incredible braking performance on the A310. It's actually more impressive than all the 320 can do, to be honest, on this runway. It's a heavy, which is absolutely hilarious. So let's just come around the corner, and we'll make sure we get past the hold short point, and then we'll set the park and brake and talk about what we just saw. I think the brakes are probably going to get a little bit hot because I've been jamming the brake on and off, but let's see. Alright, come to idle. And you can see I didn't touch the thrust at all, right? It just did it itself. So we come to a stop. I'm going to set V, which is my parking brake symbol. So let's clean the aircraft up. So what do we need to do? We can see, by the way, that this has gone blank because the FMS has cleared itself because we went slow enough and below a certain fuel flow number. So, strobes to auto, nose light to off, retract these, turn off these. So that makes sense, right? We don't need the strobes anymore, they can stay in auto. We don't need this, it can stay to taxi. Landing lights can come off, and the runway turn-offs we don't need. Start the APU, because we're going to need that in a minute. We can put the selectors to nav, which they are now. We can then disarm these, so we can see at the moment, if we look at the flight control page, see how the spoilers are up, because they're ground spoilers. If we disarm them, then they will come down, which they did. So we've disarmed them, and we can put the flaps up, like that. And we would turn the weather radar off if we were using it on today's flight as well, and we would make sure that we set this to TA only. Sorry, standby for the TCAS. So, good, the APU is running, it's already a veil. Right. So, I think that went quite well. We're gonna, and obviously we've got hot brakes. So yeah, let's put the brake fan on. It's because I used medium and was jamming the brakes on and off as well, so it's gonna get a bit hot. So why don't we watch that replay back and talk about it. Alright, so let's take a look at the landing from this view. You can see the whole idea of it is to keep it nice and stable, right? We didn't mess around, we weren't all over the place, we were just keeping that aiming point nice and fixed. Started the progressive flare, it came back to idle automatically at 30 feet and off, right on the aiming point. I might say that was pretty good. And then just slowly derotate the nose. It's a bit of a quicker derotation because we've got auto brakes medium, right? So here we go, and then we can see the ground spoilers come up, and we were stopped pretty quickly. We could have almost made the first turn off. So let's see that again. So try and keep an eye on where I'm looking at the aiming point here, okay? So you can see my mouse cursor here. I'm just trying to keep that fixed, okay? And this isn't specific to the 310, it's just, you can see that I'm flying this, by the way, with a Logitech 3D Pro. If you fly it with a yoke, it's much nicer to fly. So if you get used to it, it is not a tricky aircraft to land. It's actually very consistent and very stable to land, to be perfectly honest. And the A310 V2, I imagine, will handle it in a similar fashion, albeit with small, unique changes done to it. But this is the idea, see how I've not made any sort of abrupt changes? And did you notice I didn't touch the trim once during the approach? Not once. I did a bit of a multi-stage flare, that was a bit of a mistake, so I had to release a bit of back pressure there, and then we came down on the aiming point, which is where we wanted to be. So let's look at it one more time from the flight deck. So you probably heard me saying that ignore the PAPPs. Well, PAPPs and sceneries are often in completely the wrong spot. You can see normally they're next to the aiming point. So here it's showing me I'm high, but I'm actually aiming here, right? I want to land here, not here, here. So yes, it makes sense that it's showing me I'm a little bit high. My descent rate went a little bit high here. I wasn't that happy with that. So I ended up being a tiny little bit low over the threshold. Remember we said we wanted to be 50, I was about 35, 40, so I was a little bit low. And then looking to the end of the runway, letting it settle. And that's it. Well, there's the minimum call, because I didn't set -5. My mistake. But I say it's as simple as that. I know it's complicated, but you're landing the A310, it's not too bad. So I think we're going to end the flight here. I don't really think there's much else to sort of show you. We'll continue this series after this point. Hopefully we can do some different arrivals, some failure stuff eventually then. But it is going to take a while to finish this series off because we're in the middle of so many projects at this moment, you know. It's going to be when and can I can fit it in, because we've already got some great videos online from airline to sim. They show you how to do RNAV, VOR approaches, full departures and everything like that. So if you want to know how to get up and start it, I recommend watching those videos. This is more the sort of detail of how you do stuff. That's why I end up talking for hours because I know some people love it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll join you again in the next part.